Hello team, welcome back to episode 62 of Untold Evidence. Today we carry on with our UFO saga. Most UFO cases leave you with a story. This one left 3 people in hospital. We go back to 1980 on the night of December the 29th. 2 women and a 7-year-old boy were driving home through the woods of East Texas. What they say happened on the road left all 3 with burns, blisters, and an illness that doctors documented for years afterwards. They even took the United States government to court over it. And the reason the case was dismissed in its own way is the strangest part of the entire story. Betty Cash, Vickie Landrum, and Vickie's grandson Colby were driving home on a rural road near Huffman, Texas, northeast of Houston. It was just after 9 p.m. and according to their account, they came over a rise and saw a large, brightly glowing object hovering above the tree line ahead of them over the road. They described it as a diamond or cone-shaped with flames shooting downwards from its base, and they reported the intense heat coming from it. Betty Cash stopped the car, and the object was, by their own description, very close. The heat was strong enough that Vickie Landrum reportedly told her grandson it might be the second coming and that they should not be afraid. At one point, Vickie put her hand on the car's dashboard and later said the dashboard was hot enough to leave a handprint in the softened surface. Betty Cash stepped out of the car and stood on the road in the longest period of the 3. That detail would matter later. Then came the part of the story that turns it from a sighting into much, much more. As the objects rose and began to move away, the witnesses reported that a fleet of helicopters arrived and surrounded it. They counted around 23 helicopters. They specifically described some of them as large, twin-rotator aircraft consistent with a CH-47 Chinook used by the United States military. The implication of that detail is quite clearly enormous. If the object was being escorted, monitored, or accompanied by the United States military helicopters, then the United States military knew something about it. The 3 witnesses then drove on, but within hours, all 3 began to fall ill. Over the following days, Betty Cash, Vickie Landrum, and Colby Landrum developed symptoms: skin reddening and blistering, swelling, nausea and vomiting, hair loss, eye problems including swelling and impaired vision. Betty Cash, who had stood outside the car for the longest, was the worst affected. She was hospitalised. Her symptoms were severe enough and persistent enough that they were documented by medical professionals over an extended period of time. Her health, by the accounts of those around her, never fully recovered. Now, the pattern of the symptoms to several investigators resembled the effects of exposure to radiation or intense thermal energy. The case was investigated in detail by John Schuessler, an aerospace engineer and UFO investigator who compiled the medical records into one of the most thorough cases involved in USA history. Now, these are one of these rare UFO cases where the central evidence is not a photograph or a radar trace, it is a stack of medical records. In 1981, the witnesses filed a claim against the United States government. They eventually sought $20 million in damages, and their argument was straightforward. They had been injured by a craft that was being operated or escorted by the United States military, and the government was therefore responsible. In 1986, the case was dismissed, and here's the reason. The court found that the plaintiffs could not prove the object was a United States government vehicle. Every branch of the military that was asked stated it did not operate the craft, and it had no Chinook helicopters or comparable aircraft in that area on that night. Now, the counter-narrative taken seriously. First, the government's denial. No branch of the US military admitted to operating in that area. If that denial is true, then the helicopters were either misidentified or belonged to some other party the witnesses could not identify, or the central premise of the lawsuit was just simply wrong. Second, the medical causation. The illnesses suffered by the 3 witnesses are real and documented, but documented symptoms are not the same as documented causes. Skeptics have pointed out that some of their symptoms could have been other medical explanations, and that link to a single night's exposure, whilst compelling, was never independently proven to a legal or scientific standard. And thirdly, the absence of corroboration. A fleet of 23 helicopters over suburban Houston should have been witnessed. Some supporting reports were gathered, but a fleet that size on a popular route arguably should have generated far more. So the case is genuinely unresolved. Either 3 ordinary people were injured by something the government will not acknowledge, or the most thoroughly medically documented UFO case in history has a conventional explanation that has never been found. And neither option is particularly comfortable. What the Cash-Landrum case forces you to sit with is the dismissal itself. The lawsuit did not fail because the injuries were fake. It failed because the plaintiffs could not prove who owned the craft. And we've got to read that again. The court did not rule that nothing happened. It ruled that the witnesses could not prove the thing that happened belonged to the United States. Betty Cash died in 1998 on the anniversary of the encounter. She maintained her account for 18 years. 3 people, 1 road, a stack of medical records, and a government that said simply, it was not us. The full case file, including the medical documentation, is referenced within this description. So as ever, tell me what you think in the comments. Have you come across this story before? Does it sound familiar? Does it sound plausible? Does it sound unrealistic? Personally, I find it incredibly interesting that the case was thrown out simply through evidence of whose the craft was. Nobody seems to be denying the craft. Nobody seems to be denying the effects of the craft. What seems to be denied is who owns the craft. And to me, that in itself doesn't really pass a sniff test. We don't go from diminishing the account. We don't try and falsify the account. The main basis of this legal argument is nobody can have ownership of the craft. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. As ever, please subscribe and like. Thank you so much for listening. And we'll be here in the next episode following the evidence. See you next time.